Okay, welcome to the Bergen Forum, everybody. Remember, there is free tea and coffee. Remember, you can pick up a copy of the schedule for the rest of the semester. Two announcements. Tomorrow, at lunchtime, there's two events going on you should be aware of. One is the Environmental Studies talk over in the Science Centre, and the other is the Women and Gender Studies Roundtable in Herrick Library, where the topic will be Finland, and both look very interesting. Just one other announcement, which is that next week, the Bergen Forum will be Mallory Szymanski and Ted Forsyth, who is a philosophy graduate from AU. And they are reporting on their research into the killing of Denise Hawkins in Rochester in the 1970s. Denise Hawkins and police violence in Rochester, New York. So that's next week. Today, we're delighted to have three of our librarians, Mechele Romanchock, Kevin Adams, and Maria Planansky, and their topic is going to be Forbidden Narratives, a closer look at book bans in the United States. So Mechele, take it away.
Thank you, Emrys, and thank you all so much for coming. Welcome to Forbidden Narratives, a closer look at book bans in the United States. As Emrys said, I'm Mechele Romanchock, the director of Herrick and Scholes Libraries. And joining me today are my colleagues, Collection Management Librarian Maria Planansky and Information Literacy Librarian Kevin Adams. But before we start, we wanted to take just a minute to acknowledge that we are living and working on the ancestral lands of the Onondaga, the Great Hill people, also known as the Seneca, and that Alfred, New York, Allegheny County, and New York State at large are still home to the Seneca people. Oops. So our goal for today through this presentation is to establish a shared vocabulary for book challenges and bans, to understand the current context of book challenges in the US, and we will consider the social, political, and lived implications of such challenges. We'll discuss how book challenges are handled by Alfred University Libraries. So let's begin with that shared vocabulary. Every good scholarly conversation begins with defining terms. So what does it mean when someone says The Color Purple is a banned book? Slaughterhouse-Five is one of the most banned books of all times. So what does that mean when somebody says that? Banned book. This book was banned. Well, to get us there, we're first going to define two other terms. We're going to take a look at what censorship is, then at the term book challenge. So what is a challenge? And that will take us to a book ban. So starting with censorship, the American Civil Liberties Union defines censorship as the suppression of words, images, or ideas that are offensive. And this happens whenever some people succeed in imposing their personal, political, or moral values on others. Now, more specifically to libraries, the American Library Association's Office of Intellectual Freedom defines censorship as a decision made by a governing authority to suppress, exclude, expurgate, remove, or restrict public access to a library resource. And this is really the key part, based on a person or group's disapproval of the content or its author creator. So what is a challenge? A challenge is an attempt to remove or restrict materials based on the objections of a person or a group, like an organization. And recently, the ALA has also expanded this definition to include not just books, but displays and library events, due in part to the growing number of challenges against events like drag queen story time or pride-themed book displays, just for some examples. Now, challenges do not simply involve a person expressing a point of view or asking a question about why certain resources might be in a library collection or in a curriculum. nor does a challenge pertain to the established library process for evaluating materials in a collection. Rather, a challenge, a capital C challenge, is when someone goes through a formal process in order to have material removed from a school curriculum or from a library collection. And this has the consequence of also restricting the access of others. So schools and libraries will typically have a process for making such a formal challenge. And Maria will be going in more detail about what that can look like. So when there is a challenge to a book, it can be resolved by the decision makers in a number of ways. And so here are 4 types of possible resolutions that you might see when there is a challenge. So starting on the left, perhaps the decision is that the material will be retained. And what that means is there's no change. The item in question will stay in the curriculum or in the collection available on the shelf. As a result of a challenge, the material could also be restricted. This is a hurdle to access being put in place. So an example of this might be a minimum age requirement to borrow or access certain material, or perhaps like a signed parent's permission slip in order to check out certain library books. And I was taught in library school that even shelving, certain select items too high for young readers to reach and browse would be considered a form of restriction and therefore censorship. Another possibility is the material could be relocated as a result of a challenge. An example of this would be moving material to a different collection or location, such as from the junior high school library to the high school library, or from the young adult or teen section to the adult section. And lastly, over here on the right, as a result of a challenge, material could be removed. And that is what the American Library Association would consider to be a ban. So that is the removal of challenge material based on, a challenge based on an objection. But going back for a second to this chart, it is worth noting that this American Library Association definition is not the only accepted or working definition of a ban. For example, the organization PEN America and others consider any restriction of access to material to be a ban, any barrier. So basically in that interpretation, anything on here that isn't retained could be considered by some a ban and therefore censorship. So we're hearing so much about book bans and challenges in the news right now that it is important to remember that even though there is such a volume and intensity surrounding this topic, that book bans are in the US and in general are not new. So our scope for today doesn't allow for a deep dive into the full historical context, but there is a lot there to study. And I think a retrospective would be a great future topic for a Bergen Forum. Anybody wants to take that on? But there, here, I've just pulled out a few things to note, starting with the first known book ban in the United States, which actually predates the United States. But perhaps you already have some familiarity or some context around these particular bans, censored works, or historical events that you might already have a familiarity or association with them. I do, however, want to look briefly at one key historical moment, and that is the Supreme Court case Island Trees School District versus Pico, which was decided in 1982. The short version of the story is that in 1976, 5 teenagers on Long Island, ranging in age from 13 to 17, led by fellow student Stephen Pico, sued their school board over the removal of the books that are pictured here. And they sued on the grounds that this removal violated their First Amendment rights. When the school board, when the books were initially challenged by an outside organization, the school board formed a committee of parents and school staff to review the material. And then, acting in contrary to the recommendation of that committee, which was to retain the material, the school board ordered that the books be removed from the district's junior high school libraries, and one from the curriculum. So by way of explanation, the school board offered that the books were, quote, anti-American, anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, and just plain filthy. The court's decision could have been the final answer on the issue of book banning, at least in school libraries. Because while technically the decision was in favor of the students, however, it was not definitive or clear enough to dissuade or prevent repeated censorship attempts by school boards, parents, and outside organizations in the intervening decades, such as what we are seeing today. Now, the decision did state materials cannot be removed because they violate a governing body's personal, political, or social views. And so the decision reads in part, so I'm going to quote it here. In brief, we hold that local school boards may not remove books from school library shelves simply because they dislike the ideas contained in those books and seek their removal to prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion. The ruling, however, did not protect materials from removal under the argument of vulgarity or educational suitability, by the way, which are both very subjective and likely to be a matter of opinion. But it also did not protect materials that have yet to be added. So from preemptively, banning or avoiding materials to being added to the collection for any reason. So we do still face challenges. Librarians and other educators, have been facing challenges, for forever. And so I'd like to share some of the longstanding guiding principles and best practices for the profession of librarianship that we would draw upon in these scenarios. So two of the examples are from the these two examples, they're from the American Library Association, and that is the national professional organization for library workers. So we're going to look at the Library Bill of Rights and the Freedom to Read statement. These are just going to be little snippets of them. They're both more extensive than what we're looking at here. So the Library Bill of Rights affirms that libraries are forums for information and ideas, and it outlines basic principles that should guide library services. And that includes, in part, that books and other library resources should be provided for the interest, information, and enlightenment of all people of the community that the library serves, and that materials should not be excluded because of the origin, background, or views of those contributing to their creation. A brief bit from the Freedom to Read statement builds upon that to say that it is in the public interest for publishers, librarians to make available the widest diversity of views and expressions, including those that are unorthodox, unpopular, or even considered dangerous by the majority. It is the responsibility of publishers and librarians as guardians of the people's freedom to read, and to contest encroachments upon that freedom by individuals or groups seeking to oppose their own standards or tastes upon the community at large. So one last bit of context. I'd like to share this structure that libraries operate in. So essentially, libraries exist in three main buckets: public libraries, school libraries, which would be like pre-K through 12, and academic libraries, You could also include specialized libraries with academic libraries. And now the mission of a public library, a school library, and an academic library are all different. They have different patrons and different needs, and they exist and operate in different educational contexts. And that the Library Bill of Rights that we just looked at briefly will several times, multiple times, uses the phrase, you know, the community that the library serves. So that's different for each one of these things. So school libraries typically are very focused on providing resources to support the curriculum taught in that school or district. And public libraries aim to provide materials of interest to a broad spectrum of the public for leisure reading, reference, research. And academic libraries also support the programs and majors of their institution. And libraries and library resources factor into a degree accreditation programs, such as what we see on our campus here with NASAD, NABETS, for example. Additionally, libraries, and particularly academic libraries, collect materials on the history and evolution of ideas. Academic libraries routinely even keep outdated information when it is a primary source, or when it provides a link in the chain of how we have come to our current understanding and our view as a society on an issue or a topic, and a range of views. So all three of these also share a general mission of promoting reading and the open pursuit of knowledge. So what does it look like when you pull all of this together and enact these best practices and guiding principles and actually do the related library work in these different library contexts? So for that, I'm going to pass the podium over to Maria to take us to a closer look at that.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. I appreciate that. So Michelle went over various definitions of ban and challenges, and really now we're going to get into how to respond to these challenges, what these challenges look like at various levels, and then get into the content of what's being banned and the types of materials that are being banned. So responding to challenges, I'm just going to adjust this for a moment. Okay. One of the ways to best respond is to have a strong collection development policy and have preemptively have a reconsideration policy and procedure when a challenge should occur. Okay, in the collection development policy, it can be a lot of things. We're going to focus on the mission, purpose, and scope of the collections, and then the reconsideration process itself. And we're going to take 3 real life examples. And I see members of the audience who are very familiar with these institutions. So hi there. And so we're going to go for public libraries first and look at Alfred's local public library, the box of books. And so I pulled this collection development policy right from their website. It's free, it's available to everyone to look at. And so their policy is great. It defines themselves as a popular materials library. That means high demand items in a variety of formats for a variety of age groups are collected. It supports the ALA, Bill of Rights and Freedom to Read. And then right in the policy, it states that the collection should and does reflect controversial topics that'll generate interest, debate, strongly held and conflicting opinions by many individuals in the community. And it has a reconsideration policy with steps that would be taken if a book is challenged. Next up is Alfred Central School for our school library. And so this policy is within the overall district policies on the Alfred Central School site. And this falls in under its instructional materials section. And so being a K-12 school, this is again, a screenshot. There is a curriculum focus. The mission does explicitly connect providing access to controversial materials as a way to develop critical thinking skills. It takes into account the ability, maturity, and development of the students. And it says that part of the collection's purpose is to be representative of the diverse ethnic, cultural, and religious groups across the United States. It says nothing should be excluded based on religion, race, or country of origin. And Alfred Central School does have like a kind of reconsideration policy, and it's a policy for objections to instructional materials, and it names who would be involved in that kind of objection. It would be the superintendent, the building principal, and the librarian. So now we'll look at Alfred University's collection development policy. So this was approved this past spring. And again, there is a clear focus on curricular and co-curricular programming, being that this is a very student-centered institution. Our collection is very collaborative. The focus on students, faculty, and staff giving recommendations via our library liaison program is really taken into consideration when we purchase items and acquire materials. The policy explicitly names our effort to collect anti-racism and anti-oppression materials, and to ensure that communities often left out of higher education institutions' collections are intentionally acquired. We name our accessibility policies that we follow, ADA and SUNY, electronic and instructional technology policies. And we absolutely do have a reconsideration policy in place, and it affirms the ALA's freedom to read. So, okay, what would happen at Alfred University if a book was challenged? So to date, that has not happened yet, but what would happen? Okay, someone brought a book forth or a material forth and said, I am not comfortable with this. I would like to file a written objection to this and get it removed. What would happen is they would fill out a form. They would write out their issues with the item, fill out a form, and then the dean of libraries, director of libraries, collection management librarian, and relevant subject librarian, potentially the relevant faculty member would meet. We would investigate the item. Okay, we would match it up against our collection development policy and the purpose it serves. While we do this, the book or the resource or the item, it would remain accessible. These are following best practices. Okay, so we wouldn't preemptively take something away before a decision is reached. It would remain accessible. Once a decision is reached, the patron who objected, they would be notified in writing, and regardless of the outcome, if it was banned or not, we would report that out to the American Library Association. So that's a pretty standard way to react and proceed when a book is challenged. Okay, so now we're going to get into the banned book data and trends. And as we do, I'm going to focus on two organizations, the ALA and its Office for Intellectual Freedom, and PEN America. So the Office for Intellectual Freedom is what collects information about book bans. And I just want to note that this is passively collected, okay? So it's information that's reported out, like Alfred University would report this out to the ALA. PEN America, on the other hand, again, they also have a wider definition of what ban is. That's more proactive about the information it collects. And with PEN America, you might be familiar with them. They have book awards, but they also, every spring for the past 3 years, they've come out with a report called Banned in America. And it focuses on school book bans in particular. And it started 2021, 2022, and 2023, really coinciding with the dramatic spike in book challenges. So this is a graphic from the ALA. There are a lot of numbers, so I'm gonna sort of defer to my notes in some ways. So this graphic takes us from 2003 to 2022. And for about, 15, 17 years, unique titles challenged hovered around 200, 300, okay? But then we see in 2021, it spikes to 1,858. And then in 2022, again, it grows to 2,571. And this isn't on the chart itself, but I have information from 2023 from the first 8 months, and there have been 3,923 unique titles challenged. So we've already outpaced 2022 in its entirety. And these have come across 531 challenges. And so these books primarily feature LGBTQIA+ characters and characters of color. One of the reasons for these spikes is, I'll stay here. One of the reasons for these spikes is something called a simultaneous challenge. And so what that looks like is you could have like an anti-racism reading list of 100 books on anti-racism. And someone could take this list of 100 titles, bring it forth to a library or a school and issue challenges on all of these, kind of a blanket blanket challenge for many titles. And so that's the majority of the ways that these titles are being challenged. So in the first 8 months of 2023, 92% of challenges have this simultaneous challenge approach. In 2022, looking at that same 8-month time period, it was 90%. So this is how it's happening. This is how those numbers are spiking so much. This is mainly happening in public libraries and school libraries. You see over there, 1% of these challenges are happening in higher education institutions. As Kevin will get into, just because that number is 1% does not mean that the climate is sparing higher education in any way. So let's not sort of look at this chart and say like, okay, well, we're fine here at Alfred, because that's just not the case. The methods of book challenging, I just talked about the simultaneous challenge or multiple titles challenge. The way that you think about it normally, traditionally is, one book, one title per challenge. And that's when a patron, comes across a book and they disagree with it for some reason. They bring their objection forth. They want to have a formal challenge and they go through that process. And that's the traditional way of challenging a book. Or it was traditional. Now the method of choice is this multiple titles way. Okay, organizations and politicians are absolutely jumping on this. Organizations, national ones like Moms for Liberty, or very hyper-local organizations are also getting on this. Same with politicians. It can be a campaign rallying cry. I think many people may be familiar with the Virginia governor race from a few years ago. Glenn Youngkin featured a campaign ad that there was a woman who spearheaded a campaign against Toni Morrison's Beloved. Okay, so that was a big, talking point. But it's not just for campaigns. Okay, they're signing this into law and into legislation. It's another tactic. Another tactic is Michelle had mentioned earlier about obscenity or something being lewd as a reason to ban. So this is not new. What we're seeing more of, though, is law enforcement isn't getting involved in these because they're obscenity laws. And so there is a publicized case, and this has happened a few places, but there was a publicized case last year. A school board member in Florida called the local sheriff's office about the memoir, All Boys Aren't Blue, saying it violated obscenity laws and wanting to get the sheriff's office and law enforcement involved in banning the book. So having other actors come in to enforce bans, okay? And then finally, this is indirect, it's a chilling effect. And so it's absolutely intentional that in this climate of all these different types of bans and talking about bans and the effects and such, that, librarians, school workers have, you can't help but have a chilling effect for some, that they might reconsider, like maybe I shouldn't add this book to the collection. It might be inviting criticism where we can't really take that heat right now. Okay, so the indirect effect is absolutely intentional. Okay. And then another graphic for you from the ALA, and I also kind of want to push back on this graphic. So it says who's doing these challenges: 30% parents, 28% patrons, and then religious groups and political groups. So these are the challenge. So 30% of parents are doing a challenge. Okay. First of all, with reporting, you might have seen things in the Washington Post in the past few weeks in the New York Times. The majority of these book bans are coming from key individuals. Okay. So 30% of books do not come from 30% of parents. Also, parents can be members of groups and use their standing as a parent to bring this forth. So it's a lot more complex than this chart makes it seem. Okay, so what's getting banned, right? I'm going to switch gears a little bit to PEN America. It focuses on school book bans. And so from school year 21 to 22, again, in line with ALA findings, it's queer themes and characters and protagonists and characters of color at 41% and 40% respectively. That's what's getting banned, okay? Interestingly, PEN America found last year there was a shift. I don't know if this is a trend yet, but there is a shift. And so at 48%, the number one thing being banned is violence and physical abuse, followed up by health and well-being, and that's pretty vague, okay? So health and well-being could be anything from like puberty, going to the doctor's office, to mental health, to bullying. Okay, it's pretty vague. And then sexual experiences between characters. And so again, let's push back on this graph a little bit because things can fall in different categories. There can be something with a queer character that features bullying, okay? So that's not to say that these are mutually exclusive. And then getting into the type of books that are getting banned. I specifically want you all to look at the chart on, your right. The types of books that are getting banned. And again, this is in school libraries. But you'll see the ALA's list of banned books, and it does agree with each other. 49%, almost half, are young adult books, followed up at 19% with picture books. So YA books, YA literature, this isn't surprising, but it's really concerning, and why, right? So YA literature, it's really a powerhouse of a genre. And it's really specific. I don't know how many people have read YA books. It can run a lot of different ways, but you know a YA book when you read it, okay? And one of the reasons that YA books are so powerful, and this is pulling from the Young Adult Library Services Association, is that it's really special literature, okay? It welcomes artistic innovation, experimentation, and it really uniquely addresses the needs of its readers. And who are those readers? Those are people going through an evolution in their identity. They're searching for their self. And it's supposed to serve your unique needs, which are physical, intellectual, emotional, and societal in nature. So these are the books getting banned. And I'd argue it's not just the books that are getting banned. These are the people who are being attacked with these bans. Okay. So let's get into the titles, and I am going to go back to the ALA for this. And the majority of these titles, it's the top 10, but there are ties, and the majority of these are YA titles. Okay, and some are not YA titles exactly, but they're taught at the high school level. All right. So first up, this is in our collection. It's a great book. I've checked it out right now. This is Genderqueer. It's a memoir by Maya Kobabe. It was recommended to us to collect by a student who's since graduated. It's a coming of age memoir. It's from a non-binary and asexual perspective. It features things like awkward visits to the OBGYN and dating in college. And School Library Journal gave it a starred review. Okay. Next up is, I mentioned it earlier, All Boys Aren't Blue, a memoir manifesto, so another memoir. It's written by George M. Johnson. It's a memoir from a Black queer perspective. And George Johnson is writing about his life, about toxic masculinity. And School Library Journal says that it's a contemporary hallmark of this blossoming genre. Right. Next up is The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. I don't know. I read it recently, to re-up for this. And it's a classic, and it's a masterpiece, and it is often taught at the high school level and not in AP classes, unlike Beloved, which is often taught in AP classes. So it's more widely available to students than some of Toni Morrison's other books. And this is from a 1970 review, but it says Morrison writes with compassion, the unsinning realism of the cruel, emotional, and physical poverty of Black life in Middle America. And finally, we're just going to do the top 4 because time. We have Flamer. It's another memoir, okay? And it's a memoir from a queer, self-described chubby, mixed Filipino-Irish Catholic perspective. It's about the summer before going to high school, going to camp, bullying, first crushes, figuring out one's identity, oneself. And Horn Book Review says that it speaks so well to those kids currently undergoing the ordeal. And the ordeal is figuring out who you are and your identity in this world. Okay, so as I hand it over to Kevin, I'll leave you with why these books. So there's a really great interview with sociologist Tressie McMillan Cotton. She interviewed ALA President Emily Drabinski the other week on the state of libraries, including book bans. And Drabinski said, do they want to ban the book or do they want to ban the person? Okay, and that is, I think, really what Kevin is getting into with the next part of our presentation.
Thanks, Maria. It's a really great segue. So yeah, I want to provide some social and political context for book bans. I will be looking at this on a national level and examining implications for those that are impacted. Book bans obviously don't exist within a vacuum, and I want everyone to kind of keep that question from Emily Drabinski in mind. Do they want to ban the book or do they want to ban the person? Book bans are part of a larger movement that attacks liberties, freedoms, and the health of marginalized people, especially people of color and LGBTQ youth, which reflects the trends that you saw in those most banned books from the past year. These attacks are led by politicians, advocacy, and hate groups, and individuals. They're happening at the state level and can be seen playing out in school legislation and school boards, and in public and school libraries. While most of the attacks on LGBTQ folks focus on restricting access to healthcare, information, and basic rights for young people, the attacks on topics related to race are beginning to also impact higher education. And I wanted to share this quote from Maya Kobabe, the author of Genderqueer, because I feel that it really nicely frames one of the components of the larger picture of book bans. We're at this moment where I think there are more than ever trans and non-binary actors, authors, artists, politicians, but there's also more than ever legislation trying to limit access to healthcare for trans students, access to sports teams or school clubs, access to books. There's this dichotomy of a renaissance of art and a backlash of legislation. I feel at the crossroads of hope and despair. Kobabe situates book bans within this broader context of legislative attacks on LGBTQ youth, and I want to expand that a little bit. Anti-LGBTQ legislation especially targets trans and gender nonconforming youth, and I want to emphasize here that book bans are just one part of those attacks. While many of you are probably familiar with what's happening in Florida and Texas, I will focus on two lesser talked about states, Arizona and Iowa. Since February, Arizona has introduced bills that would limit access to healthcare for minors seeking gender-affirming care, introduced a bill that would limit access to bathrooms, especially gender nonconforming and trans people in public schools, and introduced a bill that would ban pride events like drag shows from public spaces. The Arizona Senate is currently discussing a bill that would more easily enable book bans from public schools, especially mentioning gender fluidity and gender pronouns as grounds for a challenge. All of these bills were introduced this year within 1 week of one another. So it's kind of happening all at once. While the Arizona governor has vetoed at least one of these bills, similar bills have been signed into law in other states like Iowa. In March of this year, Iowa governor signed bills into law that ban gender-affirming care for gender nonconforming and trans people. Also signed into law a bill that would make access to bathrooms much more difficult for the same group. 2 months later, she signed a bill that restricted education about gender identity, required schools to notify parents if students want to use different names or different pronouns in school, and in the same sweep, banned specific books from schools. Now, these pieces of legislation are not happening in isolated places. Rather, according to the Trans Legislation Tracker, 83 anti-trans bills have been passed in 23 states just so far this year. In addition to politicians and legislation, there are advocacy groups that are propelling these attacks forward, with Moms for Liberty being one of the key players. So you'll remember that Maria complicated a chart that stated that parents were the ones behind most of the challenges to books. This group sort of blurs that line between parent and being within a political or activist group. Wikipedia identifies Moms for Liberty as an extremist conservative political organization that advocates against school curricula that mention LGBTQ rights, race and ethnicity, race, critical race theory, and discrimination. Multiple chapters have also campaigned to ban books across gender and sexuality from schools. And according to the Southern Poverty Law Center, Moms for Liberty has been at the forefront of the battle for book bans, resorting to tactics of verbally attacking librarians and educators personally, and frequently reading passages of book bans at board meetings without any context. Now, while Moms for Liberty is based in Florida, and that is where most of their members are, you can see that they have chapters in New York State as well. This image is just taken from their website where you can use it to find local chapters. And you can see that there are chapters in Erie, Monroe, Wayne, Onondaga, and Oneida counties, not too far from here. Moms for Liberty and politicians are not only focusing their attacks on LGBTQ youth, but are also attacking people of color. This is primarily taking the form of attacks on access to information, and is another important context in which book bans exist. Here, I will focus on Texas as an example, to better understand attacks on information related to people of color, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, and critical race theory. Texas has passed legislation in 2021 that bans the teaching of critical race theory in K through 12 schools. Critical race theory is an interdisciplinary and academic field originally developed as a legal framework that is usually utilized to think about the complexities and the interwovenness of racism in the United States. Now, anybody that's interested in learning more about critical race theory, I encourage to go back and watch the Bergeron Forum from Meredith Field, which I believe was last year, and I think is on YouTube. It's really solid. But why would folks want to ban a legal framework for thinking about the world from K through 12 schools? It's sort of odd to envision, but it's not about the framework itself so much as controlling the curriculum of what's being taught in K through 12 schools. Saying that teachers could no longer teach about the racism embedded in the history of the United States makes it really tricky to teach about things like slavery. The legislation also explicitly banned the use of the New York Times tool, the 1619 Project, and prevents students from receiving extra credit from participating in civic events. It was a political and social climate that existed in Texas that fueled Texas to ban the most books of any other state in the year of 2022. The continuation of these bans in the legislation is also starting to impact higher education. So in 2023, this year, Texas banned diversity, equity, and inclusion offices and positions, banned diversity statements from job applications, and has banned the requirement of diversity, equity, and inclusion trainings. Most recently, Texas has actually proposed a bill that would ban critical race theory from being taught in Texas universities. So while book challenges do not frequently impact higher education, these larger political and social contexts can impact the way that universities hire people, train people, and may begin to impact what higher education institutions are allowed to teach. Now, while larger attacks that are being coordinated by legislation and advocacy or hate groups like Moms for Liberty have obvious impacts on already marginalized people's livelihood, access to healthcare, and general quality of life, individuals and activists are targeting and even threatening educators and librarians. And much of this is playing out at a much more local level than just this abstract, like national conversation. An NPR broadcast about the cost of book bans interviews librarians who have been harassed and threatened into fearing for their jobs and even for their lives. The cast actually quotes multiple librarians who have received death threats online after being accused of being groomers. This targeted harassment has caused depression, panic attacks, adverse physical effects such as weight or hair loss amongst those that have been targeted. And librarians in these areas where the harassment is quite bad are beginning to quit their jobs. And libraries themselves are becoming more short-staffed and having to cut back on services, hours that they're open. And it kind of gets back to that chilling effect that Maria was referring to earlier. And with 48% of these attempts to censor material happening in public libraries and 41% of them happening in school libraries, it's primarily those areas and those librarians that are being impacted. Now, most of us in this room are educators or students and know that these attitudes are not reflected by the students. I wanted to share this quote from a student that was interviewed in a New York Times piece that has kind of pulled together the student perspective on book bans. For the younger generation, it is so important to gain knowledge about the injustice others face constantly. By banning books with important context, we risk the inception of more racial injustice within our society as a whole. No matter how horrible our history is, it is more important now than ever that students are well informed to prevent repeating history. And I want to jump off from this more positive note to give a little plug for an event that's happening tonight. This event is not associated with Alfred University in any way, but it is a good opportunity for folks that are interested in supporting public libraries to learn more about how that's been happening across the country. This event is organized by a group called For the People Leftist Library Project, And they're hosting this how-to session focused on local organizer efforts to strengthen and defend public libraries. It's going to feature accounts from a couple of different groups, one in Minnesota and one in Louisiana, that consists of patrons and citizens, not just librarians, that are working in their local communities to organize to find ways to support their local libraries. One of them specifically is combating book bans and restrictions. So QR code is there. If you want to grab it again, it'll be up in a minute. So here's a quick list of our references. I know it's hard to kind of take that in. So if you want any of that, just email us. We're happy to tell you where we got our information. And we wanted to go ahead and open things up for a question and answer. Our emails are there as well if you want to ask for those references.
Thank you, Kevin, Maria, and Michelle. Questions. It's important that you use the microphone for Zoom people and for others. John.
So I'm on the local school board, and although I don't anticipate that there's ever going to be any kind of support from the board or from the superintendent for any kind of book bans, I think it's my sense in hearing what some of the parents say that what some of the local parents who object to certain books appear to be doing as a tactic is wanting some sort of book list ahead of time and then optional assignments that their children can do to avoid books that they oppose for any litany of reasons. While I selfishly am okay with that because it means that my kid gets to still get exposed to those books, I guess that might very well be their right to parent their child in that way. But I guess my question is, in any of the research that you all have done for today, did you come across any cases where a student was suing their own parent for restricting access to something that they wanted to be able to get access to?
I don't have an example of that specific issue, no, of a student suing a parent. If anybody else does, please share or speak up what you might know. I will say, though, that it is a part of the American Library Association and their policy on access of materials to minors. Their guidance is that parents and only parents should be the ones who can say what is appropriate for their child and only their child. So, you know, right. Yes. So that would be the guidance in that situation. And I will say that although it's been a long time since I have been out of the classroom, I have worked in K through 12 library schools in the past, but it's been a long time. So my best practices there might be out of date. But in schools that I have am familiar with in Maryland and New York, for example, it is not uncommon to have a mechanism of an alternate assignment in place, and that is a way to give parents an individual mechanism scoped to their family only as a way of avoiding this type of tactic. So if anybody else, well, I'm going to start Googling that later and looking up if I can find anything about that, because that's very interesting.
Hi, so you mentioned the Moms for Liberty group as people who are actively working for book banning in certain areas. And a recent article that came out, I think in the Washington Post had described that, something ridiculous, like 98% of the book bans had come or had been originated by this one person, in this particular place.
I know that article you're talking about, I think. That one case in the county.
Right. There was one case in the county where one person was responsible for.
Yeah, I read that article too.
Is it possible? So I have two questions, I guess.
Mhm.
Are there any counter groups? Like if there's a Mom for Liberty, is there like a Mom for Free Thinking Normal People? That is kind of, because I feel like Moms for Liberty is more of a fringe, like, is there a, like Rebels Unite kind of thing?
No, I know that there are.
Okay.
Gosh, if only I had my notes from my office right here. Michelle, do you have it on your?
There was only so much room on the slide, Danny, for these organizations. And I'm blanking on one word. It's called like red wine and read, or red wine and something. And it's like,
yeah, I
it's
know what you're talking
opposite. Yeah. So there are examples out there. We put just a couple of organizations besides the two most well-known that we knew, ALA and Penn. And so these are other organizations that do that work to
Okay.
support. But there is one in specific that I'm thinking of. I'm blanking on the name, so I'm going to look it up and share it with you.
And this might be a fringe question. Have you ever heard of someone suing another person? Like if you were to, this one woman who is challenging everything, could another citizen sue them for being a jerk? I mean,
No, I mean, I haven't heard of it, but I can completely see that someone could say with this specific article, with this specific case, like this person is, interfering in the education and tying up school board meetings, etc. Yeah, I haven't actually heard of that happening, but I mean, yes, that could theoretically happen. Sure.
Well, thank you all very much. Very interesting. And Maria, you had that slide with the stats of the number of challenges which have spiked in the last couple of years. And I get your point. I think it's really important that just that alone probably has a chilling effect. Do you know how many of those challenges succeeded? Do they have stats on whether or not those books are banned, or those challenges are mostly being denied?
Well, I'll yes and no. So, for school book bans, PEN America has the index of school book bans. So every single instance of a title being challenged, like it could be one title, 5 different places, etc. They have the title, the reasons, and the outcome. Okay, so that is available for the whole gamut of libraries. I don't have that access to that. For school libraries, we do have that. Yeah.
And to build on that, the American Library Association does state on their website for what they track, the majority of challenges do fail, but they have all of the negative impacts, financial, mental, physical, emotional, time, all that Maria had gone into.
For the Fiat Lux News, I got to interview a couple of professors here, Dr. Zemansky and Dr. Mayberry, about book bans, and they both brought up that they feel like most of the people who are bringing forth challenges haven't read the books that they're trying to ban. Would you guys agree with that?
Yeah, I don't know specific stats, but oftentimes the form will have a thing that says, have you read this book? And most of the time people check no. From what I've seen, but I don't have any stats on that. I don't know if anybody does.
Yeah. I would agree. It's very common to see that. Again, I don't know the number, but it is not uncommon. And it is not something that people are trying to hide either, that they haven't read it. And I've even seen forms, because for example, in Florida, those forms are public, and need to be made public, and you can scroll through them, and people will even they'll get the details of the book wrong, the author's name wrong, and they will say, no, I haven't read it, and things like that. So that tracks.
Thanks for a great presentation. And one thing that I kind of want to go back to the beginning, you had referenced the Comstock Act and kind of the obscenity laws. One question I have about kind of where this book ban thing is going is, you think it's kind of I guess you say a positive, it's almost like the pushback, like the Comstock Act was against pornography, for example, which is now normal practice in the United States and accessible to just about anyone. And there's the debate that's still going back and forth on it. And I'm not saying pornography is good or bad, but there was that pushback earlier in our history. Now it's to the point where the question really isn't even there. It's just whether you should consume it or not. Do you think there's going to be, in the next couple of years, we're seeing kind of like the last throes of like a pushback against open information, both in public and school libraries?
We might all have different answers. That's a great question. And the pushback that I see is, it's interesting. It's like, oh, it's a pushback to this new thing that's being passed. And I think the pushback we're seeing is that in many ways, the society we're living is a lot more open, okay, right? Kevin gave some horrifying but great examples of anti-trans legislation. And I think the book bans are really tied to that. That's the pushback we're seeing. I'll leave it at there for right now, if other folks want to say something.
Yeah, and I would add that, I don't know, I think that censorship kind of takes many different forms, and we can kind of see through its history that it kind of peaks in areas, but it doesn't really go away. So I don't know. And I also am wary of like celebrating a move toward a more open access to information, just because I feel like so much information continues to be paywalled and public access for information continues to be taken away. So I'm hesitant to go that route. I would love that, but I don't know if that's happening.
2 points, and then one is that there was a German writer by the name of Heinrich Heine who said some years ago that people who begin by burning books wind up by burning people. Well, you know, people who ban books wind up burning books, and I think you know where I'm going there. Second of all, you had a slide which showed us, 28% of the challenges are from politicians, 48% are from parents. I think it might have been a little bit more, accurate to say 28% are by right-wing politicians and 48% are by right-wing parents, because this really is an issue of right versus left. Liberal people, liberals generally, do not, for philosophical reasons as well as personal reasons, they don't ban books. And lastly, I just want to say very briefly that about 20 years ago, right here in the town of Alfred and also in Almond, we did have a situation where the school board banned a book. It was Tim O'Brien's In the Lake of the Woods. The book kind of touched on the My Lai massacre and so forth. I don't want to go into the details of all of that. Eventually, that ban was reversed, and it was only reversed because about 20 parents, for the most part from Alfred University, parents of Alfred kids, but the parents taught at Alfred University, went to a school board meeting and made a big fuss, and the school board backed down by a 4-to-1 vote. They reversed that ban. But the point is that, yeah, it can happen here, and it has happened here.
I would agree with you, and I do want to share though, just because I think it's interesting that I think at our moment now we are seeing this as a partisan tool, and we are seeing a lot of book banning and challenging coming from that political perspective that you described. But there are actually times that we do see it all over the spectrum, actually, but just at different rates. An example would be one frequently challenged book would be, if you're familiar with the Skippy John Jones picture books, that is challenged by people on who would I'd say be more on the left as being just negative stereotypes and not being a positive portrayal. You can look that one up and see what that's about. But also, this would be great to talk about in depth another time. But like here's an example from the 1970s. There certainly was not as much of a diverse variety of literature popularly available, and school curriculums, of course they are today, but like certainly were just honestly very white in the authors and not diverse really in any respect. So during that time, there was a large spike in challenges from the NAACP to try to force diversity into the curriculum, feeling like there was just no other mechanism, trying to use other channels, that not working, and say, then, you know what, we're going to use this tool too. So there are times that, it is used at all sides of the aisle, but I would agree with you that right now we are seeing that balance that you described.
So to Gary's point about the book that was originally banned by the school board here, part of the parental argument was that it was part of the AP curriculum administered at the time by the New York State Board of Regents. So we had support from the state of New York as well. But Gary's point is very well taken, that it can happen locally anywhere. But my question is, and I don't mean to be asking too broad a question, but is this particular to the US democracy at this point, or are we seeing it in Canada and other at least titular democracies in the Western world. Because I support Gary that, yeah, 28% of the right politicians and 48% of the right parents are responsible for this.
We definitely scoped our research to the US. I mean, there are certainly internationally well-known cases of book bans and censorship. Salman Rushdie comes to mind, Pinochet, censored and banned, but, I don't actually know. I didn't spend a lot of, I didn't really put thought into, I didn't look into that. And so that's a great question. But I would suspect that I would find that there are book bans elsewhere. However, I feel like the moment in time that we're in is a partisan tool. And so I would, my guess is that I would find that we are in a unique position, not that it's going to be zero elsewhere. So I'm curious, Canada, you mentioned is interesting. And so that's something that I would love to look into.
I can chime in a little bit on that international question. Argentina is
you.
facing a presidential election coming up pretty soon, and it is a frequent topic within the campaign trail and among especially Argentina's right-wing fascist-like movements, whose candidate seems to be a near front runner. And it's generally talking about, Michelle, you just mentioned Pinochet in terms of Chile, but it's around memories of the dictatorship and whether that was a horrible time that nunca más, shall never be repeated, or if it was a moment of heroism, right? Of a triumphant moment for the country that ought to be celebrated. And it's fought over viciously currently. Yes, you're welcome.
When I said that Becky was going to ask the last question, I lied because I had a question. And it's this: if I was a parent wanting to ban a book, to be honest, what I'd do is I'd just take the book out and not return it. And why don't more people just do that?
They do.
No,
Don't.
yeah, no, it's a comment. I mean, don't do that. But no, it's a common tactic. Like this other people chime in, but like a lot of the time, like occult books go missing very frequently from public libraries, and on certain topics, they need to be replaced very frequently, and things like that.
Did you want?
No,
Yeah.
I would hope that parent would realize that that's going to actually have the opposite effect, because what's going to happen is we're going to buy that again and continue to drive up the sales of that item. And so what's interesting, and it's the reason why this is so clearly a partisan effort, is that it does not work. Every one of those books is a bestseller because people are like, what? Thank you for bringing this to my attention. And it's like, and honestly, in some respects, people have even criticized the American Library Association as saying, you're just driving up things to be bestsellers. There's different perspectives on that. But people will even push back against the capitalism of book banning. You know what I mean? So there's a lot to talk about. But that has the opposite effect. And I will tell you that somebody on Facebook live streamed themselves destroying library books that they didn't agree with. And then, I can't remember exactly what happened. You can find it. They actually got fined or legal action for publicly destroying public property. It was the opposite effect. Yeah, we'll just buy it again if you do that, but please don't.
Well, this is very interesting to know that you can drive up sales of a book by petitioning it to be banned. If someone would like to petition my last book to be banned, that'd be great. But thank you for a wonderful presentation, very informative. And